Over large areas of Britain, the rock that dominates the landscape is limestone. Its broken angular faces tend to command the high ground, which is a strange reversal of its fortunes, as it was once at the bottom of the sea. If you get a chance to fly over it, you can sense its strange marine quality, for it's a biological rock, made from the skeletal debris of once living things. There's still 300 feet of limestone in this quarry. Another 300 feet have vanished through erosion. The quarry provides high-quality limestone for the steel industry, but cuts across Giggleswick Scar, which marks the great South Craven Fault in Yorkshire, running 20 miles between Ingleborough and Settle. But unless you know what you're looking for, you can miss some of the important limestone features in the countryside. From a distance, Wenlock Edge in Shropshire just looks like any other low ridge of hills. It is in fact a reef limestone, at least 400 million years old, and on top of the ridge the limestone is clearly revealed. To get the feeling of its structure though, you need to get inside the ridge to see a vertical section cut by quarrying through the thin layers of the rising sea floor. While you can see that the bulk of this face in this quarry is composed of very thinly bedded limestones, the beds are about 2 or 3 inches thick, I'm standing by a lump that must be about 8 or 10 feet high that is actually not bedded at all. Its boundary near me is that sort of shape, and you can see the narrow beds going away to my left. See, this is apparently a reef of coral in the position in which it grew. And there are a number of them in the quarry. In fact, there are a number of them along Wenlock Edge. They are more resistant than the rest of the limestone. Their weight has compressed the beds underneath. They've actually sagged underneath the weight of the growing reef. And later, the weight of sediment above this point has depressed the limestone except where the reef is, so that the beds appear to arch over it. The corals that form these ballstones, quarrymen call them, are more easily seen in a better weathered face, and I think we can find one a bit further over here. When you look inside one of these ballstones, you can see structures. You can see here 2 bushes of a coral, a colonial coral, in fact. You can see where its base lies, and over to the left you can see a rugose coral colony. Now it's these colonies that create the frame for the ballstone, which put it in complete contrast with the thin beds of debris, fossiliferous debris, that are lying on either side of it. This block has fallen from the top of the face. It's now got its bedding, as far as you're concerned, nearly vertical, where you saw it in the face horizontal. What it allows us to do is to look closely at it, and you can see little fragments of sea lily or crinoid stems which actually make up the main mass of the beds. The top of the Wenlock limestone is called the crinoid band. The thing about all this is that it is difficult to see everything in a weathered face. It grows algae and lichens and things like that. And it's much better, as usual, to examine the thing carefully in polished specimens, the sort of things that are now doorsteps or shop fronts. This is such a slab, and as you can see, where we had to hunt in the quarry for the odd specimen, here we can see absolutely everything that's exposed on the face. Now, Julia Hubbard is a limestone expert. You've studied limestone all around the world, I think. Can you tell us what's going on in this bit of rock?
Well, really, there are 3 things. Firstly, there's the pink mud of the background. Then we have cross-sections of corals, which look like tubes of spaghetti and macaroni. And then thirdly, we have the crystals of white calcite.
These crystals of white calcite, what are they doing there?
Well, you can see the coral is dissolved away from this area.
Yeah.
It was aragonite and is now replaced by another form of lime, the calcite.
I see. Now, this slab, in fact, is younger than the stuff in that quarry that I was in. That was Silurian, while this is Devonian. Now, you've got some Silurian fossils here, I think.
Oh, yes. Now, we've got the crinoid, the sea lily, which was attached by a stalk to the seabed.
That's the thing we saw bits of.
Yes, but this is the whole head.
Yeah, that's super.
We've got the attached single coral and the colony of corals from here. And then we've got the other creatures that move around, such as the trilobites on the seabed.
Now, there are lots of limestones in the geological timescale, and as we get younger from the Silurian, therefore, presumably these things evolve.
They do evolve, and the corals are the best to show it. If we go up to the Carboniferous, for instance, we will see the big solitary corals, which get as long as a metre long. And then we'll see this extraordinarily etched colony of corals. They're both extinct. But 200 million years or so later, you have corals from the Jurassic, looking like present-day things. A solitary thing, a colony we've seen before. But look at this brain. We've not seen that. And then there are the things from the seabed, like sea urchins.
Those are super, aren't they? They're just like the things you can pick up on the beach nowadays. Now, does that mean that somewhere limestone is forming now?
Oh, yes. If you go off to the tropical seabed, shallow waters, you can see the limestone actually forming. And I've made a film of this actually going on in Florida.
From the air, you can get a good idea of the environment. Shallow tropical seas with sand hollows showing up as pale patches in the darker areas, which are grass beds. The grass, it's a real seagrass, is actually holding the sediment in place. Other things grow here which are actually contributing to the sediment. The mermaid's shaving brush leaves fine aragonite crystals behind it when it dies. Without the stabilizing effect of the plants, the sediments would be moved around by every whim of the current. When you fan the sediment, you unearth roots looking like strawberry runners. Amongst the vegetation, you find animals. The king crab is the nearest relation to extinct trilobites. The burrowing sea urchin only comes up at night. This one is a skeleton. But lots of things, like the flexible soft corals, won't make the fossil record. Even the stony corals may get eaten away before they're buried. This brain coral is already infested by feather duster worms boring through it. And although some fish fossils survive, on the whole their skeletons tend to dissolve on death. In this area you can also see islands being formed as the sediments are being stabilized by the mangroves. The mangroves are already at work quite a way out. You can see the powerful prop roots of this very young tree I've just pulled up. But the first stage of stabilization is still the grass. I sieved a bucket of mud to see what was in it. Snails and shells, just the sorts of things we can find in limestones. And in a finer sieve, there are the pellets, which are the excrement of the creatures. Chemically, even these are fine aragonite crystals. The islands themselves are a hostile environment for animals, with tropical heat and desiccation, generally high salinity and sudden cloudbursts of fresh water. But some of the humbler plants, particularly the algae, do well. They form mats, like chamois leather, which bind the upper surface of the mud together. They're quite elastic. If you dig them up, you find that as soon as you break the gelatinous surface, the powdery white mud starts to escape. Inside, you can see bands of rotting mat, preserved with fine bands of lime mud, which swamp the area during storms. But if it gets at all churned up, it loses any kind of internal structure, which is probably why so much limestone is so hard to interpret.
This kind of analysis is helping us to work out the environments that made the limestones in Britain. Wenlock Edge, which we saw earlier, is only one of many. It dates from the Silurian, some 430 million years ago. Later came the Carboniferous, perhaps 345 million years old. Most of it outcrops across the central areas of the British Isles. On its southeastern flank is a narrow strip of younger Permian limestone of about 280 million years ago. Then 180 million years ago, we get the wide band of younger Jurassic limestone. Still further south are the youngest Cretaceous limestones, only 100 million years old. These are just the major limestones in Britain. There are many minor ones as well, because limestone-producing seas have been fairly common in geological history. By far the most extensive outcrop is the Carboniferous limestone, laid down 345 million years ago. So most people's memories of limestone country contain its special images. You can see it in lots of places, but one of the best loved is in the Yorkshire Dales, where it's crossed by the Pennine Way. I've stayed up there for many years and learnt a great deal of what I know there, and so I've a very strong spiritual affinity for it. The beauty of limestone landscape to me is that its bones stick out, that you can see what's underneath the surface and what's forming it all. The characteristics of the thing are that the rock itself is very rich. It had a rich origin, and yet the landscape is very austere. The landscape that it creates is harsh, and it has these two major elements. The bedding planes, I'm leaning on one, are near the horizontal, and there are joints through every bed at great intensity, and they are near the vertical. So we have these two contrasting lines that keep being repeated through the landscape. And the thing has been cleaned off by water in large quantities at the end of the last glaciation. Permafrost still plugging all the holes in it, because now, of course, it's a waterless landscape. Every drop that falls on it goes down through, and it's the effect of that water, the solution of the limestone so easily, that has widened all these cracks, whether they're bedding planes or whether they're joints. They've all been widened, and the whole thing appears as a set of separate blocks, as though somebody put them one on top of the other. And the landscape elements have been so obvious to men ever since they looked at it that they have names for them. The vertical faces are scars, which is a Scandinavian word, almost certainly. The classic example of this landscape is called karst in Yugoslavia, and karstic scenery has been applied to this for a long time. And the near horizontal surfaces, where they're bare, are known to everybody as pavements, as limestone pavements, and they have their own characteristics. It's extraordinary stuff to walk on. You can't ignore its powerful patterns. It's like picking your way over a continuous frieze made out of blocks of abstract sculpture. And there's another odd element in the character of this landscape. It's dry valleys, deep channels that in this waterless place are totally mysterious in origin if you aren't used to the ways of limestone. This one is neatly divided by a medieval stone wall built to separate the sheep from Bolton Priory from those of Fountains Abbey. Now I'm standing at the bottom end of this valley. You can see it behind me coming round the bend in a gorge-like form, then widening out. It clearly was worked by water. The whole of the limestone landscapes are cluttered with dry valleys. They were water-worn originally. And the time for this must have been during the last glaciation, at least during the last phases of the last glaciation, when we know permafrost plugged every hole there was. Water couldn't go down any longer. It had to come out at the surface, and everything had to melt. The snow, the ice, the permafrost itself, all had to melt, and at that stage a torrent must have come down this valley, filling it probably for a brief period of time, and then leaving the limestone in this spectacular way over a fault scarp, creating, however briefly, perhaps the most spectacular waterfall in Britain for that time. A phantom waterfall over 100 feet higher than Niagara haunts this great horseshoe of Malham Cove. The stream in the valley doesn't flow over the cliff, but under it. Surface water has sunk through the limestone until it found an impermeable layer of slate. This behavior of water is part of the fascination of limestone country. Rivers just vanish down into holes and tunnel new underground routes for themselves through the rock, dissolving and digesting it into a honeycomb of caves and passageways. Only the local water table determines where the process is halted, but it provides a wonderful playground for the adventurous, the potholers and cavers who spend their leisure in the labyrinth. Eventually, the water becomes supersaturated with limestone and precipitates some of it back into rock. The stalactites and stalagmites that seem to flow out of the roofs and floors of the caves are part of the reward for being thin and agile and putting up with hours of discomfort and of danger. And if you don't like doing things the hard way, there are plenty to see in the show caves. If caves collapse as they seem to have done in part of the Cheddar system, the result is a spectacularly deep gorge. Limestone, particularly that same limestone of the lower Carboniferous Sea, is what determines the scenic value of a lot of famous beauty spots. The cliffs of the Gower Peninsula are made of it. So is St Govan's Chapel. So is the Great Orme's Head in North Wales, the sentinel of Llandudno. And huge tracts of Ireland are made of it. On the flat tables of the Aran Islands, you can see it clearly because the soil is so thin. Farmers here virtually have to make soil for their crops from seaweed. And on the Irish mainland, another famous display is the Burren in County Clare. Its eroded steps look like huge old fortifications, the ramparts of ancient kings and legendary warriors. There is yet another kind of limestone in Britain. The south of England takes a wholly different character from the chalk, with cliffs that stand like bulwarks against other foes, the invaders and the sea. Chalk is a rock that is so familiar to many of us from childhood that we think we know all about it. But it has its own specialist scholars, and one is Dr. Jake Hancock from King's College London.
Here we're below Beachy Head in Sussex. And because I'm working close to high cliffs, I'm wearing a hard hat for safety, because it's very easy for blocks to fall off on me. These cliffs are nearly 200 meters high, and that is really quite a considerable thickness for all one formation, this white rock, the chalk. If you look at this for yourselves, it just seems to be a white powder. But if you look at it with an electron microscope, you find that it's made up of myriads of little tiny pieces of marine algae, little tiny plants that lived in the sea here nearly 100 million years ago.
This chalk has been magnified thousands of times. The little fragments actually measure only 1/1000th of a millimetre across. Originally, all the pieces were arranged in coccoliths, or rings, and you can see that although parts of the rings are still preserved, most have been broken up. When it was alive, about 20 of these complete rings were arranged in a ball inside the soft tissue of the plant.
In the chalk, these coccolith rings have broken up into their component particles, but here in this very, very much magnified model, you can see what they look like when they're all put together. But you can work out that the chalk has actually been formed in the sea, because if you have a look at a face of chalk, you can often see in it these curious white markings which represent the burrows of marine animals such as prawns, or again, these little tiny white markings which are the burrows of marine worms. Not only can we show that this chalk was formed at the bottom of the sea, we can work out something of the depth at which it was deposited. If you look at some of the other fossils, such as this sponge here, this is a type of animal which at the present day lives at depths of hundreds of meters. far below the present-day continental shelves. So, in order to find a comparable present-day sediment, we have to look at the oozes formed in the deep ocean bottoms. If you look at the present-day continental shelves, you find the sediments there are of clays and sands and really quite shallow water limestones.
This sample came from the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean and has been magnified thousands of times. It's made up almost entirely of complete coccolith rings. That is Cretaceous chalk, nearly 100 million years older, but strikingly similar. The differences that are there are because of evolution. The plants have changed in 100 million years, and because the Cretaceous chalk was not deposited at anything like the depths of the Atlantic. But why are they then so similar?
During the late Cretaceous, when the chalk was being formed, sea level was exceptionally high, so that right across northern Europe there was very little land left unsubmerged. One of the results of this was that it carried those oceanic type sediments onto the continental shelves where we are. But there is another reason why the chalk is so pure, and that is that even the land that was left unsubmerged was undergoing very little erosion, probably because the climate was non-seasonal, and a non-seasonal climate makes for a very low rate of erosion. Most limestones are quite hard because they've recrystallized shortly after they've been deposited. But the chalk, this is still quite soft. You can crumble it between your fingers. This is because the calcite crystallized by the algae that have formed this rock is a form of calcite that is stable at ordinary temperatures and pressures. And so the chalk that you see here has hardly changed at all since it was deposited nearly 100 million years ago.
Away from the glittering cliffs, the character of the chalkland changes. It becomes more simple, more gentle. Kipling celebrated the blunt, bow-headed, whale-backed downs of his beloved Sussex. But other men have known and worked and loved the chalk far back into prehistory. Chalk confers the gift of fertility on the soil. These slopes would soon be obliterated by trees if they didn't provide such good food for the trees' competitors. But even if the grazers and nibblers keep the grass short and springy, there is plenty to support the real chalk specialists, the corn bunting, the much more rare Dartford warbler. Because there's real richness here, rarities can survive. And for most people, some of our most precious survivors are the orchids of the chalk. Here you can believe that the rich life of the long-dead Cretaceous seas is being born again.